Governor J.B. Pritzker delivered his budget proposal this week, and he gave a speech describing how he sees the state of Illinois right now. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, February 20th, 2026. I'm Peter Hancock, and this is Capital Cast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. The 2026 legislative session is now officially underway. Governor J.B. Pritzker unveiled his budget proposal for the upcoming year and delivered his 8th State of the State address. Here to help us unravel what we heard and how lawmakers are reacting to it are my colleagues Ben Selensky and Brendan Moore, as well as our editor-in-chief, Jerry Nowicki. Guys, thanks for being here on a Friday afternoon at the end of a long week.
Thanks for having us, Peter.
I'm ready for the weekend, Peter.
Yeah. Well, to start off, Governor Pritzker presented what many would describe as a lean budget proposal. We all sort of knew that was coming. We've talked about it on the podcast before. But before we get into the nuts and bolts, let's listen to how he set the stage for his budget plan.
Prudence demanded that this year's budget proposal seeks a discretionary spending increase that is less than 0.5%. It levels off and in some cases reduces programs that are important to me, some of which were proposals of my own. But I believe that the imperative of responsible governance and overcoming the fiscal irresponsibility of past decades must come ahead of the interests of any one politician, of any one program, or any one party. That doesn't mean that we can't make transformative progress. We won't let headwinds from Washington stop us from addressing the fact that Illinoisans, like Americans everywhere, are still paying too much for groceries, too much for housing, too much for electricity, too much to live. Everything is just too damned expensive. And that's why now more than ever, we must work together to make life more affordable for Illinois' working families.
So, Ben, I wanted to turn to you first. The word affordability came up a lot. That was sort of the theme of the day. And I guess you could say it's not just what everyday families are able to afford, but also what the state of Illinois can afford in terms of the budget. Why don't we start off, what were the top line numbers of the budget and how much can the state of Illinois afford this year?
Yeah, not much, really. This is a $56 billion budget, which is about a $900 million increase from the current fiscal year. But when you cut it down into what's actually discretionary spending and not, annually required mandated spending that increases every year, the actual total spending increase is about 0.5%. So this is essentially a flat budget outside of increases to education, healthcare, and pensions that the state must increase every single year.
Okay, and why is that? We've talked about how revenues are flattening out. Overall, what's going on here that it causes the belt tightening?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is kind of two circumstances. There's one, the economy, and the state is not expecting a ton of natural revenue growth this year. The baseline forecast from S&P Global that they are using to craft the governor's budget proposal does expect consumer spending is going to remain up and there's not going to be a recession or anything in the coming fiscal year. But I think there's still a lot of uncertainty over tariffs. Even if the Supreme Court is striking it down, the president still wants to implement tariffs. And a lot of it is also just really because of the president's ever-evolving policies. I don't think the state truly knows how much it's going to receive in federal funding, and that makes it really hard to craft a budget when certain areas of the budget are dependent on state funding that's factored in, or federal funding, that's factored into every proposal, and every program that receives it would have a massive gap if the federal government one day just decides to cut it off. So I think lawmakers and the governor are trying to be pretty conservative about it, knowing that, at the end of the day, there could be big holes in this budget just because of a decision the president makes one night.
Okay, so the budget didn't have any big, bold new programs, especially like the ones we saw in his first year in office. A massive capital investment program. Nothing, that really reshapes state government as a whole. But there were some little things in there that centered around that theme of affordability, which is a big issue with Democrats right now. Talk a little bit about some of those proposals. What's in there that he says will sort of make life more affordable for everyday working individuals and families?
Yeah, I think the main one is this housing affordability proposal. The governor's proposing a bunch of changes that would see the state get a lot more involved in zoning requirements. So obviously, I think we're going to see a big fight with local governments over this proposal. But ultimately, what the governor's housing proposal boils down to is he is trying to create a way to increase the supply of housing in the state, which he hopes will in turn lower the price of housing as the demand is met and there's a greater supply, and that would help bring down prices. So, the governor talked a lot about a lot of issues like that, and just trying to find ways where state government can do its part to enact programs, incentives, and other various ways where, it can make life more affordable beyond, just things that are in the state budget, such as taxes.
Okay, so when governors put together a budget, a big part of the underpinning of the budget is how the administration views or how economists view the overall economy at the time and where they think it's going. You talked a little bit about this a minute ago. A big part of that this year had to do with international trade, which is a big deal in Illinois, and the impact of President Trump's tariff policies. We're recording this on Friday, so things are fluid, things are developing, but we just got word this morning that the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that some of the tariffs that President Trump has imposed unilaterally are unconstitutional, that he didn't have the constitutional authority to impose them. How might the reversal of tariff policy affect this budget or other budgets in the near future?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, if the tariff policies are reversed and we don't see more from the president, it'd probably be a boost to consumer spending. I mean, that's been one of the hangups here is, consumers are getting squeezed because prices are rising based on the tariff cost that is passed down to consumers at the end of the day. So, I think there's probably some optimism if there's going to be fewer tariffs that's going to ultimately help things like sales tax and potentially other forms of taxation where consumers have more power to spend their money. But it's one of those ever evolving things, as we know, because after the Supreme Court decision, the president said he still wants to implement 10% tariffs across the entire world under a different section of the law. So who knows if we'll ever truly get a resolution that's actually going to satisfy consumers and actually give a boost to the economy.
Well, Brendan, let's turn to you and talk about the reaction to the speech. You wrote a story. The headline of your story was that Democrats offer muted praise for Pritzker's speech and Republicans dismissed it as campaign rhetoric. First of all, why were Democrats less than thrilled with the speech that Pritzker gave here?
Yeah, so the word that we used in our story was muted, but another word could be measured. That they acknowledged that it's a difficult time with some of the federal cuts coming from the federal government, and they touted the governor's efforts to protect key programs from the chopping block. But some were a little disappointed with the defensive posture, and we're hoping that perhaps Pritzker would go a little bit more on offense and perhaps increase funding for critical services like healthcare, childcare, and education. And this is obviously also in the context of, we had a state budget impasse in Illinois a decade ago that really gutted a lot of social service programs. And a lot of those are just kind of in recovery. And now that there's all these cuts that have been threatened and maybe coming down the pike from the federal government, those are under threat again. And obviously under the tax changes at the federal level, a lot of wealthier folks are going to be getting some tax breaks. And so there are some proposals out there that would increase taxes on the wealthy that a lot of progressive lawmakers would have liked to have seen in a budget proposal. But the governor largely proposed a status quo spending plan. So I think that there's going to be a little bit of discussion about, things that can be done kind of beyond what was proposed. House Speaker Chris Welch has been touting a millionaire's tax that he would like to get on the ballot. It has to be approved by voters in November. Obviously, it wouldn't affect necessarily this year's budget, but it would provide more money for future budgets. So I think there's going to be kind of that conversation of where we need to go, with all the cuts coming from the federal government.
Well, I did want to ask about that leading up, really over for the last 6 to 8 months since Congress passed the big, beautiful bill. It was called H.R. 1, the new federal budget, and it contained a lot of spending cuts that you talked about at the federal level, as well as tax cuts. Progressive lawmakers and a lot of progressive interest groups, thinking the Illinois Federation of Teachers jumps to mind, were really pushing what they openly called a tax the rich agenda. They referred to that plan as this huge transfer of wealth from lower income classes of Americans to the upper income, especially at least in terms of transferring tax burden. So what are the chances, is the sentiment still out there in the legislature to, tax the rich, kind of rebalance the tax burden, at least here in the state of Illinois?
I think certainly among the most progressive legislators that they would vote for a tax the rich agenda tomorrow if they could. Obviously, Governor Pritzker in the past has expressed support for progressive income tax in the state, although he's not pushing for that this year. I think that there's going to be a menu of ideas that get debated. I think some of the more unlikely are, say, like a wealth tax that has been brought up, but been dismissed by the governor, and there's some constitutional questions there. But there are some there is one I would like to note that was in the governor's budget proposal, which is a tax or some call it a fee on social media companies that aims to raise about $200 million.
Yeah, I think the Republicans
funding.
called that the TikTok tax, which at least has that nice alliteration to it.
Absolutely, and that one is more of a populist. We're going to go after the big tech bros, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, and so we'll see if it ends up in the final budget. I don't know who's going to go to the mat to defend those guys. So we see a little bit around the edges of some new revenue, perhaps going after the pockets of people that can afford it. But at the same time, there were no broad-based increases, proposals to increase taxes. And obviously, if you want to increase taxes on the wealthy, since we have a flat tax, and that's in the Constitution, it would require voters to approve it first, and obviously legislators to put it on the ballot. And I know Speaker Welch would like to put it on the ballot, would like to put up for a vote, but that also takes support in the Senate, and the Senate president has not said whether or not he would support that.
Okay. So I'm thinking back to last year. Pritzker drew a lot of attention here in Illinois and maybe nationally, as well as a lot of criticism from Republicans after he compared Trump policies with Nazis in the 1930s. And he went so far as to suggest that people who were supporting Trump were maybe similar to the Nazi sympathizers before World War II, or Nazi enablers. Talk a little bit about how Republicans responded to this speech.
Well, House Minority Leader Tony McCombie actually said that, well, at least we weren't called Nazis this year. That's a positive step. So they didn't. There was not a lot they liked in the speech, predictably, but McCombie and also Senate Minority Leader John Curran noted that the rhetoric was toned down a little bit compared to last year, which came, last year was about a month into Trump's second term, and there was the Nazi allusions and a lot more charged political rhetoric from the governor. There was some of that in this speech too, but not as much, I guess, red meat, aimed at Trump and perhaps at his supporters. But yeah, Republicans, they overall didn't really like the speech. They noted that, obviously affordability was the big message, but they said it was more rhetoric than anything. They pointed to rising energy costs. Obviously, property taxes remain incredibly high, just the cost of living in the state is high, and they did not believe that the governor proposed solutions that can actually address those things. Although they did appreciate that the governor is taking action to encourage more the development of more nuclear power in the state. And also, there seemed to be bipartisan support for a proposed cell phone ban in schools. So there were some things that everybody could agree on in the speech, but overall, a pretty predictable split depending on if you were a Democrat or a Republican.
Okay. Well, that makes a nice segue into my next question. And I want to turn to Jerry to talk about some of the non-budget aspects of the speech, the actual state of the state element of it. We often get history lessons in Pritzker's speeches. He's fancies himself as a student of history. Like I said, last year we learned about some pre-World War II history and the advent of the Nazi Party in Germany. This year, he went back even further to the end of the 19th century to talk about Illinois' 20th governor, John Peter Altgeld, who gave us a State of the State speech in 1895 that went on for 60 pages. To put that in perspective, Pritzker's speech this year, his 45-minute speech was only 19 pages long, and that was double-spaced. So I'm thinking that 60-page speech was kind of a stem winder. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, before we get to the tape on this, what was the point that Pritzker was trying to make here? What are the historic parallels between today and the 1895 era?
The parallel he was making even came down to the fact that, this President Grover Cleveland in his second non-consecutive term, that was interesting to me that's the way he packaged the lead into this section, because obviously Trump is in his second non-consecutive term, and he went on to touch on the Pullman strike in Chicago, in which the federal government was sent in, federal troops were sent in to quell that what is now a historic event. And I think just basically he was equating the Pullman strike events with the aggressive immigration enforcement actions that we're seeing that have led to multiple people being shot and just several horrifying videos.
Okay, so let's listen to part of what the governor said about that.
The strike fizzled after 25 people had been shot and killed, and many more wounded. But Governor Altgeld never forgot President Cleveland federalizing troops against Illinoisans. 6 months later, when he delivered his message to the General Assembly, Altgeld devoted fully half of those 60 pages to the events surrounding the Pullman strike. His anger at the federal government's overreach jumps off the page even 131 years later. If the president can, at his pleasure, send troops into any city, town, or hamlet, whenever and wherever he pleases, under the pretense of enforcing some law, his judgment, which means his pleasure being the sole criterion, then there can be no difference whatever in this respect between the powers of the president and those of the Tsar of Russia.
Okay, so last year Pritzker took heat for comparing President Trump to Adolf Hitler. 130 some odd years ago, Governor Altgeld compared President Cleveland to the Tsar of Russia. You think, was Pritzker trying to get himself off the hook here for last year's speech? Or
You know, I don't know if I'd say that, but it did kind of, you know, I felt like the speech tied Republicans' hands a little bit because he went into, I love my state, I love my country, you know. He framed it in the battle of good and evil again, but he talked way more about good. You know, what he did would characterize as the good side as opposed to uh, dwelling on the other side of things.
Well, let me ask you this then, and getting back to some of the Republican criticism of the speech, there's all this speculation out there that Governor Pritzker wants to run for president in 2028. How much of this speech do you think was a pre-presidential campaign speech, and how much of it was really just an Illinois State of the State speech?
Yeah, everything the governor does kind of has one foot in both of those lanes really at this point because he is still the leader of the state of Illinois. He is seeking another term and he is running for that election, you know, now. But clearly he's got eyes on 2028 with, I mean, Brendan and Ben have reported on the number of media appearances that he's doing with national press, with national podcasters, and it just goes up and up. So, I mean, clearly he's always got one foot in each lane there. But frankly speaking, we knew how the Republicans were going to react to this. Like, I'm sure they had their press releases written before the speech was even given. And, you know, at least he didn't call us Nazis is about the closest thing you could get to praise from a Republican, you know, going into the after speech, you know, posturing that we see every year. So he did. I mean, I'm sure they went into that speech expecting to hear some of the same, you know, Nazi comparisons as they did, but you know, putting it into that historic perspective and then just drawing the parallels there, it did, you know, make for a different after speech, you know, reaction cycle.
Okay. We will leave it there for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Before we go, I'd like to invite everyone to visit and subscribe to our new CNI Insider page at capitalnewsillinois.com. There's a link to it at the top of our homepage. That's where you can find all kinds of premium content, as well as Brendan Moore's insider column titled More from Springfield. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.